have two 12 by 12 squares of muslin laid on top of each other. I'm going to pin them together along one side. For the first line I'm sewing, I'm going to be lining up my seam along one of my guidelines. I'm going to use the 1-inch guideline on this machine. I'm going to sew a straight line all the way down along that guide, starting by back stitching, and then continuing all the way down. Now, I'm going to line up my seam at the same point again, and I'm going to stitch over directly on top of the stitch. It may be helpful to use a different color thread so that you can see your new line of stitching. So instead of using my guideline for my stitches to follow, I'm going to follow directly along this line I've already stitched. So now that we've stitched over one line, use your piece of fabric to do a few more to practice. For additional practice sewing straight lines, I'm going to use a few more techniques as I continue practicing stitching over. I took my gridded ruler and drew 2 straight lines along my piece of fabric. For our first line, we're going to sew using the red line as our guide instead of using the seam line guides. We're going to place the needle directly on the line and follow it. Now for our second line, we're going to sew with our presser foot guiding against this line and sew next to it, keeping an even space away from this line. So now I'm going to line my needle up with this line that I've drawn and sew along that. I want to place my needle in the fabric, and I'm keeping an eye on the line in relation to my needle and also my presser foot. Also keep in mind that anytime my finger is pointing towards this needle, my foot is not on the foot pedal below. So I'm going to start by going forward and back stitching my stitch in place, and then I'm going to lightly guide the fabric with my hands, but I'm mostly going to let the feed dogs of the machine do the rest. Just light pressure, making sure the fabric stays straight. And since I do that line with my gridded ruler, it's fairly straight itself. And now we're going to just sew over it again and practice sewing right over that line, follow the same thing. I'm going to just lightly guide the fabric with my hands. I'm putting very little pressure on it. Just want to make sure it stays straight. Now for this next line, instead of following directly on the line, I'm going to follow next to the line. So I want to sew a parallel line right next to this. So I'm going to line up the outside right edge of my presser foot along this line. And so instead of actually watching where my needle is going solely, I'm going to be looking back and forth between this line and my presser foot and the needle itself, just as if I was sewing along a guideline here with my seam allowance, but it's just much closer proximity, so I use my presser foot as a good line. This is a good technique to keep in mind for top stitching. If I had a fold or a seam line here, I would be following along that line. So again, I'm lightly guiding with my hands, letting the feed dogs do most of the work, but keeping my eye right here along this line. Now we're going to stitch over that line one more time. Now I'm keeping my eye going back and forth between my needle sewing along this line and my presser foot following the same guideline. Have my series of lines that are stitched over themselves, and I did a few more practices until I filled up my piece of muslin, including stitching next to a line that I'd already stitched.